Well, good day, everybody. Welcome to Seed Speaks. This is a video series brought to you by Seed World Group. My name is Mark Zinkowitz, and I am an editor with Seed World Group. This month, we're talking with people from across the industry about science communication and how we as an industry can better educate the public about it. Today, we're talking with three experts about an important question. Do GMOs have an image problem? I'm joined today by Andreas Bucher, a professor at the University of Guelph, specializing in best practices in communication about novel technologies, in particular agricultural biotechnology. Welcome, Andreas.
Hello, Mark. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Coven Senapathy is a writer, journalist, and speaker covering science, health, food, and parenting. Her writing has appeared in outlets like Slate, The Daily Beast, and Forbes. She's also co-founder and contributing editor at SciMoms.com and is based in Madison, Wisconsin. Welcome, Coven.
Thanks, Mark. I'm looking forward to this.
And last but not least, Jen Arman is Vice President, Business and Corporate Development for Okanagan Specialty Fruits. If you're not familiar with the company, it is the creator of the Arctic apple, which is a non-browning apple created through biotechnology. And Jen is joining us from North Carolina. Welcome, Jen.
Thanks for having me.
Now, before we tackle this question of why GMOs and biotechnology in general have an image problem, I'd like to paint a little picture of that image problem. A recent survey by the American Marketing Association found that consumers feel that GM foods are unnatural, immoral, and unsafe, which is interesting because the survey notes that some 70% of processed foods in Canada and the United States already contain GMOs. A 2018 Chinese study found that nearly half of people surveyed had a negative impression of GMO foods. The European Commission has implemented strict GMO labeling laws. The list goes on and on. I could go all day and talk about these sorts of surveys. I want to go around the table and ask each of you about this, starting with you, Andreas. You've
Mhm.
researched this extensively, consumer impressions of GMOs and biotechnology. What have you found about negative consumer perception of GMOs? What are some of the big things that consumers think about them, and why do they think that?
Yeah. So I'd like to go back a little bit in history because the first GMOs came to market in 1996. And I'm from Germany. I did my PhD in agricultural economics at Kiel University in 1996. And yeah, um, the background was very important. The mad cow disease had just broke and created a crisis, total breakdown of trust among European consumers in the EU Commission, and the what was perceived as a conspiracy between industry and government, where consumer interest and consumer safety was put at the very end of the priority list. And up to that point, GMOs were a non-issue in the public. The EU Commission had or, authorized the approval of a number of GM varieties to be produced in mostly in Southern Europe, so Romania and Spain. Up to this point, are probably the only countries where GMOs are produced. And from the very beginning, it was very clear to those who were um, active against the this new technology, that they would have to put something tangible into the discussion, and health risks and the unknown risks in the long term were repeated over and over again in communication, in the mainstream media, but also in the emerging channels online. And At the same time, the two main companies who are offering these products and trying to also push them into the European market, that was Monsanto and Syngenta, they never really had to deal before with consumer concerns, and they did not do a very good job in addressing these concerns. And as a consequence, there was also quite a bit of resistance among farmers to, and there still is in Europe, to even try these products. And from this point onwards, the unknown risks in the long run, which are, by the way, associated with every new technology, are really mentioned very first at the very, the most by consumers when they address concerns or speak about concerns about the technology and the perceived unnaturalness. So the two opening statements that you gave, they capture this very well. And the reason for that is that consumers don't have, or the average consumer does not have a science background and cannot fully or easily understand what is actually being done to create and produce genetically modified foods, organisms, or crops.
So, in a way, the fear that was understandably created when mad cow disease hit has sort of snowballed and migrated into the GMO realm, and so that fear about an unknown technology, something new, something I'm not sure about, something that I as a consumer don't have a lot of knowledge about, in people's minds, they sort of relate that back to a health scare like mad cow disease, and they think, oh, well, what if something like that could happen as a result of me consuming GMOs?
Yes, that's, I think at least in Europe, the mad cow disease crisis really paved or created fertile grounds for consumer fears. And these fears were not, they were substantive because there were incidents or rising numbers of a German human condition that is similar to the mad cow disease, which typically doesn't show in young people, but there was an increasing incidence of this condition in humans in the 1990s, and that was associated with mad cow. And the same could have been true or could become true for GMOs, where basically there was no anchor point, no reference point of similarly, like, let's say, revolutionary breeding techniques that nobody was used to. As a reminder, so hybrid breeding was decades old. People were used to it, but it's also interesting to note that hybrid breeding until the 1960s and 70s was also rejected by some organic producer organizations back in Germany.
Interesting story to tell. You were once staunchly pro GMO. In the last few years, your views have become a little more nuanced, I think would be a fair term. While you're not at all anti-GMO, you don't have an issue with the science. You've written that you no longer go to bat for GMO technology as you once did. This is really interesting for me because as someone who writes for a seed industry publication, I've heard many stories from people who were once anti-GMO and who have now become pro-GMO, but I haven't had an opportunity to hear a lot of stories from people like yourself. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of your views and why those views have evolved to where they are today?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Yes. Okay. So yes, it is an interesting evolution and transformation. And it's actually more common than you might expect. So I know several people, including scientists, who have gone through sort of similar transformation. And so around 2013 and 2014, as I started leaning into my pro-GMO stance, as we all know, the buzz and the polarization around ag biotech was hitting a sort of new crescendo. And so the reasons that some of my colleagues and I leaned into the pro-GMO stance are complex, but included a few elements that I can touch on here. So, first, the rampant anti GMO misinformation exploited the fear of parents, often in misogynistic ways that targeted women and other people assigned female at birth. And so, as I explained in a Slate essay from earlier this year, as someone who cared about science and justice, GMOs weren't only safe, but the precise transfer of desired traits seemed elegant. And so, some of my colleagues and I became leading voices in the pro GMO movement. Now, things started to change in the late to late 2010s. And I started paying attention to the calls to decolonize science and decenter white men, essentially. And I also started to pay attention to the discourse around the so called benefits of GMOs and also to power dynamics and history. So, in the Slate piece, I used golden rice as one example of traits that I once found noble and later found myself really deeply questioning. So, this rice, of course, is engineered to be rich with beta carotene, the precursor to vitamin A. And vitamin A deficiency is a leading cause of mortality and morbidity worldwide. And proponents argue that it could save millions of children whose diets consist mainly of rice. And at one point, it felt natural to me to worry about children whom genetic engineering could help only if this opposition would back down. But as my thinking shifted, I started wondering about the role of, for instance, colonialism in contemporary global patterns of malnutrition. So it's obviously really complex, but research does suggest that European colonization played a significant role in malnutrition. So the fact that millions of children lack a varied diet rich in fruits and vegetables and that malnourishment patterns are related to colonization, I think is something that's crucial to interrogate. So proponents framing that golden rice is a gift to the developing world now reeks to me of scientific imperialism and of perpetuating band-aid solutions, really, while suggesting that poor countries should be thankful. So that felt kind of gross to me and some of my colleagues once we started, really paying attention. And the response to this golden rice essay was really enlightening. It brought to mind something that I often point out, and that is that those running the pro-GMO discourse, they preach a scientific gospel, which is basically that if you're pro-science, then you must be pro-GMO, and if you're anti anything to do with GMOs, then you're anti-GMO and therefore anti-science. But that polarized lack of nuance isn't about science. It's really about ideology. So this is all to say that too often anyone questioning the context around genetic engineering ends up labeled anti-science. So it's not anti-science to question golden rice or the problem with field corn as a crop, whether or not it's genetically engineered, and so many other related questions. So anyway, that's a bit in a nutshell about how that evolution went down. But you can read a few pieces that I've written about this, and I do have more to say about it than I could talk about today. And I'll be doing that in some upcoming projects.
Well, and I think what's great about your story is it really makes you think differently about this because it's not simply an issue of, well, are GMOs safe to eat? Yes, they're safe to eat, but there's something bigger at stake here. What you're saying is it's not just about the safety of these products, it's about a lot of the, I guess, social issues that we have to talk about and different business models and some of the harms in society that you could say some business models really help to reinforce, and how do GMOs play into that. And so it's not strictly a discussion about safety, but it's really a lot bigger than that. And what I love about your story is how it really made me think a lot differently when I first talked to you about maybe being on this episode of Seed Speaks, and we had a good chat, and it really made that little light bulb in my head go off that, oh, this would be a great topic to talk about, because really all I've ever talked about on the air about this topic is about the safety of GMOs, but there's really a lot more to it than that. So thank you for being on this episode. Jen, Okanagan Specialty Fruits created the Arctic apple. Now, this is a GMO apple that will not turn brown when cut. I've written about this apple before, and Kavin actually had the pleasure of touring your facility and tasting the Arctic apple. I'm curious, in the research I've done about the Arctic apple and the articles I've written about it, it really seems to have this product really seems to have escaped a lot of the anti-GMO sentiment that's out there. It seems to have been received very favorably among consumers. I was hoping you could sort of talk a little bit about that. What has consumer response been to the Arctic apple, and how have you gone about communicating with consumers about any concerns they might potentially have? Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Sure, sure. I'd be happy to. One of the things that we made a decision on very early in our commercialization efforts was to be transparent in our communications. And I think as an underlying philosophy and tenet of how we would move forward, that was actually met with criticism by some. And we felt that it was so important to be clear and open about what we have done and why we've done it, and how the Arctic apple technology is actually a very as elegant as Savin had mentioned. Some of the technology is very elegant, and that our goal is to actually increase consumption of apples, which a bit of a travesty, but per capita consumption of apples in North America has been flat for decades. And so how to make apples more convenient. And so what the consumer response, Mark, has been, well, varied in the sense that we've certainly had pushback from an anti-GMO stance. But by and large, when consumers taste our product and when we take the time to explain about what we've done to create the Arctic apple, we have overwhelming acceptance of the fruit. And that's been incredibly exciting for us because time and again, a consumer will say, well, I've tried fresh cut apples and they just don't taste very good. And wow, I open a bag of these and they taste fabulous. They smell fabulous. And I think the other piece of information that plays really well with consumers is when they learn about the sustainability aspect of the Arctic apple. Tesco did a study 5 or 6 years ago now that demonstrated that up to 40% of all apples that are produced are never consumed in any way, shape, or form, with a large part of that loss, as you might expect, occurring in the consumer's home. And I think that's been one of the things that has also been very attractive to the consumer when they understand that our apples can last longer in their refrigerator, that they're not going to be wasting their hard-earned money when they buy these apples. So, but overwhelmingly, time and time again, we have consumers say, well, I just need to understand a little bit more about what you do. And we say, well, we turned off the gene that causes the apple to go brown. And they're like, oh, well, that sounds pretty simplistic. And it really, in its basic, form to the consumer, that is simplistic, but that's what we've done. And so there has been pushback, back to your original question, but that was honestly fairly early on in our commercialization efforts. What we find today is consumers very happy to have the product, happy to have something tasty and convenient for their children to eat, and something that they can expect will last in their home refrigerator.
Now, Jen, it sounds to me like a big key to your success in this has been giving consumers knowledge about the product, what it is not, and really, the more you arm people with knowledge, I find the better they feel about these things. Andreas, I'd like to get your take because you've done a lot of research in this area about consumers and why they think what they do, and what role does knowledge play? I mean, when you give people more knowledge about a product, does that change their opinion of it?
So we can approach knowledge on the role of knowledge in two ways. First of all, we have to measure it if we really want to find out whether it's having an impact. And so what we found is that, or what has been found across a number of studies, is that The GMO opponents or consumers who are very critical of the technology tend to rate their knowledge about the technology relatively high, or higher than those who are in favor or indifferent about it. But another point is what type of knowledge is available. And one thing that is also clearly evident from research is that the potential benefits of GMOs are not known to the general public. There's a very simple reason for that, because the first generation to which the majority of crops belong does not have a tangible benefit for the consumer directly. So in this case, the Arctic apple is a great exemption, and that is one reason that we typically find when consumers are given information about potential or likely benefits of GMO products, they tend to rate these products more positively afterwards. So there is some lack of information that can be, yeah, found in among consumers about modern agriculture in general. So if you go back 50 years, a lot of Canadians still had some relation, some contact to agricultural production and farming. That is now very much reduced, and surveys show that Canadians, 90% of Canadians know little or very little to nothing about agriculture. So that's why it is also the information or the knowledge about this breeding technology or modern breeding. If we go to gene editing, for example, it would be very much the same picture, that there's very little information or knowledge available to the consumers.
That makes a lot of sense because I know when I have my breakfast cereal in the morning, I don't think, oh, there's definitely GMO corn in here. It tastes exactly like conventional corn. There's absolutely no difference. And of course, the most high profile GMOs, of course, are GMO corn, soybeans, canola. And when you eat them, you can't tell the difference. There's no benefit just to look at them. Whereas something like the Arctic apple, a consumer can actually see right on their plate that, oh, this makes a difference in my life. It doesn't turn brown. I can make a fruit salad. I don't have to worry about my kids not eating it because the apples turned brown. And so I guess the Arctic apple maybe represents sort of a new generation of GMOs where consumers can actually see literally on their plate the direct benefits. Now, Kevin, as I mentioned, you tasted the Arctic apple and you wrote a piece about it for SciMoms.com, where you wrote, and I quote, after seeing the simplicity of this non-browning apple up close and trying them for myself, I would love to see browned, bruised apples become a relic of the past. Now, as a consumer yourself and someone who's very well versed in this, does a product like this influence your perception of this technology just by virtue of the fact that people can actually see the benefits with their own eyes?
Yeah. So full disclosure, Arctic Apple covered my trip out to visit their facilities in 2018. And yeah, not only is it so cool to see on your plate, I haven't had the opportunity to have Arctic apples in my home, although I've tried we've had the dried product. But I would imagine that it's really cool, as Jen touched on, to not have to throw out bruised apples as bruising isn't only cosmetic, it can accelerate the sort of process of apples going bad. And that's one of those misconceptions that can affect someone's view, is this idea that it might, that it's just cosmetic, which it isn't, of course. And so it was super fun to see up close. I'd really love to see non-browning versions of all kinds of produce that brown, including avocados, whether that's done with RNA interference or editing. I would just like to see it. So.
Now, Kevin, you also wrote in that piece a few concerns you had, questions in your mind about the ultimate sustainability of products like GMO apples and other GMO fruits. Can you sort of give us a brief rundown on that and what some of the questions in your mind were about sustainability in that regard?
Sure, and these were also questions that the other Sci moms have. So the five of us Sci moms, three of us are scientists, and then two of us, including myself, are journalists. And so ultimately, from everything that I have learned, I I I think it's pretty clear that in theory, comparing apples to apples, I guess you could say, a non-browning version is going to be more sustainable, or comparing avocados to avocados or cherries to cherries or whatever. So we did have some questions about like the energy that goes into the inputs sort of that go into making a sliced bagged apple as opposed to being able to get a whole apple, which we would prefer to do. Of course, probably the sliced bagged apples is going to be less sustainable in some ways than a whole apple. But as Jen touched on, there's a lot of apple waste in people's homes. So maybe bagging them and giving them to people sliced up is going to increase, how much people eat. So these are all sort of questions that have been bubbling in our minds, and I believe, or I'm aware, that the latest I heard is that that y'all are kind of looking into getting some more data. So I'm looking forward to seeing how it comes out.
Yeah, Jen, we're nearing the end of our episode here, and I still want to take a couple of questions from the audience before we sign off. But Jen, what are some recent outreach efforts that you've made to consumers where you give them information about this product and maybe answer questions like that? Can you run through a couple of those and just sort of explain what's your advice to companies who've maybe run up against some questions like this and how you generally go about addressing that?
Yeah, well, so what we have found is anytime we have the opportunity to actually hand the consumer a product and have them taste it, and we can engage in a dialogue or provide them a link with additional information, that is very, very positive. And we actually recently handed out samples throughout the San Francisco Bay Area and had tremendous response to that. We have a litany of consumer testimonials when they got the product. People saying things like, well, no, I don't like to buy bagged fruit because it never tastes as fresh as when I slice it at home, but these apples taste fantastic. And wow, this is so convenient. I'm so happy to be able to get this product and to have it in my car with my children. So I think to Kevin's point, I'm kind of old school myself, and so buying whole produce is something that I've always done. But I will say that now that my household is shrunk to two, buying things that are pre-sliced is really convenient, and it does minimize waste, and that's important on so many levels, not just on my personal level, but on a greater environmental level. If you're thinking about, as Kevin mentioned, the inputs that go into producing that crop, and then actually shipping that whole crop, that then up to 40% of it never gets consumed, versus shipping a whole crop without the core and it all gets consumed, that is, just from a fuel standpoint, tremendously sustainable. So yes, over the next several years, we will be gathering data to demonstrate that sustainability, but we see it daily in our own operation. And so that's a real benefit, but the greatest benefit is how great these taste, and consumers just love them when they get the chance to eat them.
Now, before we sign off, I have a question from the audience regarding maybe a bit of a question and also a comment. There have been several statements in this episode about providing scientific information and knowledge that sways people's opinions. Is that really what changes people's minds? For example, Okanagan Specialty Fruits is very open and communicative in their approach, and I think that matters more than necessarily explaining the science. Jen, we'll start with you. Do you agree that maybe being open and communicative with people can maybe be a little bit more of an effective strategy as opposed to just explaining the science to them?
Yeah, absolutely. We have bent over backwards, to be honest, to try to meet consumers where they are and answer their questions, engage in respectful dialogue, and also acknowledge when someone doesn't want to have our product, that is their choice, and it should be their choice. We don't want to take that choice away from them. And we've made that very clear over the years, just like we don't want our choice taken away from us and being able to access the product. So I think that approach and that being very responsive has helped us along the way. We always say, look, ask us anything, and as if it doesn't compromise our confidential business information, then we'll tell you the answer to the best of our ability. And accepting other people's opinions, I think, is also been super important for the acceptance of the Arctic apple.
What's your take on that, Calvin? Could that be maybe one of the keys of sort of helping solve this image problem that we have with GMOs and biotechnology, as opposed to inundating people explaining science? Maybe it's about being open and communicative with them and doing our best to answer the questions and concerns that they have.
Yeah, so I think having the science out there in plain language for people to read and understand is important, because some people are interested. But I think Jen touched on this a little bit when she talked about being open to people's opinions. I'm not sure exactly how you put it, but it reminds me of this. I've spoken to several professional associations, ranging from biomedical research to nutrition to science communication, and I often give an overarching piece of advice, and that is to steelman the criticism. So you might have heard of the term straw man, which is basically refuting sort of the flimsiest possible interpretation of criticism or of an opponent's argument. And too many people in the biotech space, I think, rely on straw manning. And the steel man is the opposite of that. So to begin to tackle criticism, you really have to first build the most robust version of that criticism, even if some of that criticism contains misinformation to start with. And I think it's important to understand the impetus behind criticism or even misinformation, and not simply aim to debunk. So there's certainly a lot more to say about this. We're short on time, but yeah, really kind of level up the respect of the discourse, which I think some parties do better than others on all sides of the so-called debate.
And finally, Andreas, could that be a major key in informing consumers on this issue, is just being open and communicative with them? Is that an effective strategy? What's your take?
Yes, absolutely. So discourse and engagement have been shown to be effective in helping clarify misunderstandings, or being able to explain things in an easier way than, for example, a typical science communication would do. And with science communication, there are millions of ways of doing it wrong and ineffective. And that's where we could go back to the beginnings, when companies like Monsanto and Syngenta behaved very condescending to arrogant when they first responded to the criticism 20, 25 years ago in the European Union. And that is still part of the narrative, that, yeah, they wanted to use the power, or as Kevin had said, science imperialism to some extent, to tell the other side that they are absolutely wrong. And this is sort of a bitter taste that still resonates with a lot of people when they perceive science communication to be authoritative and condescending, and telling them that they are wrong. So that it actually achieves the opposite.
Great insights, everybody. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. I could go on for a lot longer, but that's all the time we have. So thank you so much, Kevin and Jen and Andreas. It's been great talking with you. Loved having you on. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone.
Join us again next week when Alex Martin will tackle the topic of the GMO labeling battle and its influence on consumer mistrust. Thanks again to our guests today, and thank you to our audience for spending your lunch hour with us. This is Mark Zinkowitz of Seed World Group signing off. Have a great day.